Welcome to the UK column, and today I am delighted to be joined by Vanessa Beeley, by Eva Bartlett, and especially by Cynthia McKinney, former member of the US House of Representatives. Today we want to talk about the situation in Gaza. All three of you have some insight to bring to this. So I'd like to begin, if we could begin with Cynthia. Most people will know who you are and your background and so on, but I'm interested to get some insight into your experience with Israel and the Palestinian issue.
Well, I guess my experience started on the Israel-Palestine issue. Of course, the entire issue of U.S. foreign policy was one that interested me academically. And I took that academic background into the United States Congress, where I served for 12 years. During my very first campaign for the Congress, I come from the state of Georgia. I have lived always in the city of Atlanta, or metropolitan Atlanta, when I represented metropolitan Atlanta and then very small towns and suburban areas within the state of Georgia while I was in the Congress. And that was the real sort of eye opener for me, because then the very first thing I was asked to do was to sign a pledge of loyalty to Israel. Now, when I said this was back in, this was 1992 when I was running. And when I said it, people didn't believe me because no one had ever said anything like that before. And now, of course, it's very commonplace. In the UK, you have certain groups that require the parliamentarians, while they're campaigning before they get elected, to make this pledge to Israel. And the same thing happened with me, where I was asked to do the pledge. I refused to do the pledge. And as a result of that, I was in day-to-day trench warfare for the entire 12 years because I didn't go along with the plan. And I presume that I was the first one who didn't. I certainly was the first one to blow the whistle on me being a US citizen having to pledge my allegiance to another country.
Yes, that's a hugely interesting point. Eva, you have spent time in Gaza.
Yes. So I went to Gaza by boat from Cyprus in November 2008. It was part of the Free Gaza movement, which the main focus of which was to bring light to Israel's draconian siege on Gaza since, I believe, 2007. So by now it's, over 15 years of a completely and utterly brutal siege. And so this was 2 years prior to the Freedom Flotilla movement, which did not make it to Gaza and which was violently attacked, the Mavi Marmara and other boats, by the Israeli commandos, I believe. But my boat was the third of the Free Gaza movement, and we did make it to Gaza in November 2008. And I went there with the intention of staying there. In 2007, I had spent 8 months in the West Bank as an activist in some of the most hard-hit areas where Israeli invasions occurred or Israeli illegal colonist violence against Palestinian civilians occurred, many other things. And at the end of those 8 months, I was deported by the Israeli authorities because they don't like people to witness their crimes. So the only means to get into Gaza for me at the time was by boat. I had tried to enter via Rafah, the Egyptian crossing, to no success. So in November 2008, I did enter. And then about a month and a half after arriving there, Israel commenced its December 27th Israeli massacre of Gaza, which went on for about 3 weeks, during which time I can't remember now how many other internationals there were volunteering with the ISM, but maybe 5 or 6. And when we realized of course, nobody could realize how terrible the Israeli massacre would be, but we understood that there was a need for foreign voices to echo and to add weight to what the Palestinian voices were reporting, because we have different audiences. So we stayed there, and we also decided to accompany Palestinian medics in their ambulances mainly because we knew historically Israel targets Palestinian medics and ambulances, and they have done so this time. They've killed at least 10 Palestinian Red Crescent medics in the line of medical duty. And we also chose to ride in the ambulances because we knew that would be a way to see and document some of the worst Israeli war crimes. So in doing so, I did see and document many war crimes. An ambulance I was in came under Israeli sniper fire, at least 14 shots, if I remember, targeting the uniformed Palestinian medics who were on the street during ceasefire hours, which were supposed to allow Palestinian civilians to get food, get water, to move. And an Israeli sniper targeted these medics who were uniformed and who should never, under international law, be targeted. And eventually one of the medics was shot in the leg. Thankfully, he didn't die. But some days prior, a medic I had worked with one evening, the next day, went out on a call, again, uniformed. This man was a volunteer medic. He was actually a high school teacher, and he'd been volunteering as a medic for 10 years. And an Israeli, must have been a tank, fired a dart bomb or a flechette bomb directly at his ambulance, where he was loading a body into the ambulance, and he was shredded with these razor sharp darts, and he died. By the end of the 2008-2009 Israeli massacre of Gaza, 23, I believe it is, Palestinian medics were killed and another 50 were injured. So that was the beginning of my experience in Gaza. I did stay a total of 3 years, a year and a half at first, and then I left via Rafah. I did go back another time in July 2011. I had to enter by tunnel because I couldn't enter via Rafah. I stayed for a couple of months. I left by tunnel, and then I eventually went back a number of times via Rafah for another year and a half, during which time I did meet Vanessa at the crossing. I forget what month that was, maybe August 2012. I don't remember. But both of us were in Gaza. I believe Vanessa was already there in November 2012. I had gone back to Canada and dropped everything and tried to get back to Gaza as quickly as I could when Israel commenced its assault on the Palestinians of Gaza in November 2012. I could speak a lot more, but I won't right now. But I could speak a lot more about other aspects of life in Gaza, including not only the brutal siege, which decimates and continues to decimate every aspect of life, every possibility of living for Palestinians in Gaza, but also the Israeli brutal attacks on Palestinian farmers and fishers, which is a daily thing, which, altogether makes life utterly impossible. And just to note, back in the 2014, 15, maybe earlier 2012, the UN was saying by 2020, Gaza would be unlivable. And back in 2014, I wrote an overview saying, well, Gaza's already unlivable. And now here we are in 2023. Gaza was already unlivable many, many years ago. And now Israel has just amplified that by a magnitude that, even though I lived there for 3 years, I can't comprehend.
And Vanessa, as Eva says, you've also spent time in Gaza. Just give us a little bit on your experience in the region.
Yeah, well, basically, I first of all tried to go in, I think it was in June or July 2012, via the Rafah border. Neither Eva, myself, or even Cynthia, I think, would be allowed in through the Erez border, which is controlled by the Zionists. The only way in for us is through the Egyptian border crossing, which is in the Sinai, close to El Arish on the coast. But even that is still very much controlled by the Israelis. Just for people to understand, even if you make it officially through the border, you have to go from the Rafah border across a kind of buffer zone by bus, because if you don't get on the bus, and if, for example, you try to walk that buffer zone, you'll be shot by the Israeli soldiers that are guarding that buffer zone, even between Egypt and Gaza. And so I tried, I think it was in June 2012, but there had been, from memory, a shooting of Egyptian soldiers during Ramadan. And that meant that everything was kind of shut down and we were actually unable to get to the border. I think, as Eva said quite correctly, we met at the border during that time. And I think, Eva, you got in and I was kind of sent back to Cairo. And we then tried again in November. I entered through the tunnels, literally, I think, again from memory, 3 days before the Israeli aggression started in November 2012 and continued for 2 weeks. And actually, just before the aggression started, we were in Khan Yunis when the 13-year-old boy, Hamid Abu Daga, was mown down by Zionist forces. He was shot at by helicopters, and there had been a tank incursion into Palestinian territory inside Gaza. And he was killed while he was playing football outside his house. This is a regular occurrence in Gaza. Nobody is safe, even within the walls and the barbed wire of the concentration camp. Nobody is safe. Eva mentioned the farmers and the fishermen that are regularly fired on, but even civilians, because again, before the Israeli aggression started, there was a killing of mourners at a funeral. I think to the south of Gaza. Eva might be able to correct me. And then, of course, there was an assassination of al-Jabri, one of the Hamas officials, just before the aggression started. And, you know, for people to understand, when there is no war in Gaza, it doesn't mean the war finishes for the Gazan people. Eva mentioned the farmers and the fishermen. But the Israeli Air Force, almost on a daily basis, fly faster than the speed of sound and create sonic booms inside Gaza, which maintain the PTSD and the trauma for Gazan civilians who can't escape anything that Israel decides to do to them. In 2013, when I returned to Gaza to actually establish a project for helping the PTSD orphans and children inside Gaza, I was sitting with a small business organization, and we heard a massive explosion. This is in what should be described as peacetime, right? When we went outside, there was the charred remains of a young hospital porter on his motorbike who was just going to work. And he'd been assassinated summarily by an Israeli drone, literally as he was going to work. None of these crimes, which happen on a daily basis, are even recorded in the West. They're not even mentioned in the West, because Palestinians have been dehumanized to such an extent that these daily assassinations or detentions or imprisonments or simple abuse by the Zionist forces is happen with impunity. They're not held to account, because nobody investigates the Zionist crimes except the Zionists themselves. And, you know, my experience in Gaza, the same as Eva's, and Eva's is far more extensive than mine. If you can imagine an area 40 kilometers by 12 kilometers, which has no exit point that isn't under the control of the Israelis, including the sea. You know, many people mention, well, they can leave by the sea. If they go beyond, for example, what is the ever changing limits of their sea territory, they will be shot either by the Israelis or by the Egyptians. And so therefore there is literally no escape. Israel pollutes the sea around Gaza deliberately. So even the one pleasure that they have to enjoy the sea is, you know, also fraught with danger of the pollution that is effectively being poured into it by the Israelis. Water, electricity, internet, food, all basic necessities are controlled and are cut off at any point that they want to collectively punish the Gazan people.
If I can just quickly add to that, I won't go on too long. And thank you, Vanessa. So the sea issue, as you rightly said, the water is polluted both intentionally by Israel and also by the sewage water, which cannot treat because Israel hasn't allowed, on so many levels, Israel hasn't allowed materials in to, for example, rebuild the Seoul power plant, which Israel destroyed in 2006. Israel doesn't allow building materials for Palestinians to rebuild the infrastructure, the homes and other buildings Israel destroys in every massacre and in times, as you mentioned, Vanessa, when it's not even an official war. And the sewage treatment facilities, Israel doesn't allow the materials in for Palestinians to build new sewage treatment pools so that they can treat the sewage. Their only option is to either flush it into the sea if they have electricity to do so, or if they don't, what often has happened is it overflows. And then there have been atrocities in which the combination of heavy rains and the sewage water overflowing has actually drowned Palestinians, as in 2007. So those are, of course, all completely preventable crises that Israel has deliberately engineered. And then when the fissures, as you mentioned, they try to, even as little as a kilometer or even less, they're shot at. If you imagine the equivalent of a surfboard, it's called a hasaka, and these skinny Palestinian fishers will paddle out on this with nets and drop their nets and later pull the nets in, hopefully having caught fish. And even when these, they're just wearing shorts, you can see they have no weapons whatsoever on them. They will be attacked by a massive Israeli gunboat firing machine gun fire at them. I mean, it couldn't be clearer that this is a targeted policy of harassment against the fishers, as happens in the border regions against the farmers. And if the fishers do manage to catch anything, it's in these polluted waters. And the other fishers would be in trawlers, which Israel easily can overtake because they don't have large enough motors for them to escape when the Israeli gunboats come and start firing, again, machine gun fire, heavy powered water cannons, which can shatter glass and even wooden structural elements, or cannon fire. And if they're not destroying the boats, they're stealing them and kidnapping the fishers. So, I mean, like Vanessa said, these are policies you just don't hear about in the media. And they have on a daily basis. And then as for the farmers, there are so many people that live or did live and work in the border regions, the wrong expression I'm using, in the eastern and northern regions of Gaza's territory. There are farmers, there are farm laborers, there are entire families, including elderly and children, that would go on their land to try to eke a living or grow some food. There are children and young men that go and scavenge in the rubble to try to find materials to resell, to be used in reconstruction, since they can't import construction materials. And there are young boys that go out to catch birds. I mean, I've taken so many testimonies of young people, youths particularly, that the Israeli soldiers, knowing darn well what they're targeting, have targeted and killed or maimed them. And they do this either by Israeli soldiers that get out of their jeeps at the border and assume sniper positions and fire on the farmers. And I've been on many, many occasions with farmers and come under this intense sniper fire, or they have remote controlled towers, which are able to fire accurately, and I don't know where the Israeli soldiers firing are, but they're a very safe place away, and they're targeting literally unarmed Palestinians. And one other aspect is, in these eastern and northern areas, the Israelis have bulldozed all the trees that used to flourish there, all the fruit and nut and olive trees that used to flourish there. It is a wasteland of arid land, although it's the most fertile land in Gaza. It's the agricultural area. They've destroyed it to such an extent that there's no excuse for them to say, oh, we couldn't see, we were targeting what we thought were quote unquote terrorists. They know they're targeting Palestinian farmers or children or elderly, and they can see it with the naked eye, much less with their surveillance equipment. So it is definitely a policy to drive Palestinians off their land and to kill Palestinians, as they can do wantonly with no accountability.
When we went to protests in Beit Hanun, for example, which is in the area that Eva was describing, I was told that the automatic gun turrets that line the wall that contains the 2.4 million Palestinians inside Gaza, they changed the settings. So, for example, 1 week it can be, if you come within 2 meters of the gun turret, it will automatically open fire. But then another week, they will change it to 4 meters or 5 meters or 1 meter. So those farmers and those kids never know where the red line is beyond which they can be fired upon by the automatic gun turrets. And this is part of the constant psychological warfare that is waged against Palestinians by the Israelis.
each of you is making a series of very important points for the audience to understand. And I just wanted to just add that basically, from my point of view, life in Gaza, I was actually able to get inside after trying to get there twice by sea with the various flotillas that were organized, but we were each time intercepted. I tried twice, and we were intercepted. One once the boat was completely destroyed. The other time we were arrested and sat in prison, actually, in areas very close to where the fighting is going on right now. So I've been sort of following that. But what I really wanted the audience to understand is that you've got people who are trying to live normal lives in the midst of something that's quite abnormal. And really, almost no matter how much Eva and Vanessa can explain their experiences, it's like nothing else that average, ordinary people living their lives every day have ever experienced. It's really hard to relate to it. But what I can say is when I finally got into Gaza with Viva Palestina from George Galloway, we were in one of those buses and we passed by a wedding. And that, to me, I left there thinking, there's love in this place. There's love in this place. People are living their lives. They're falling in love. They're getting married. They're having families in the midst of all of this, everything that you were describing. So when we actually got to go inside to see, I think I was there under Operation Cast Lead. There was nothing left. The Israelis had bombed the schools. We went into schools that had been bombed. They bombed everything. And it's almost impossible to think that there was anything left to bomb. So they're bombing the same things over and over and over again. And I think what captivated me and probably captivates Eva and Vanessa as well is that what we see is a demonstration of what I call courageous resistance. These are people who are fighting, and they're not alone, but, you know, in terms of world public opinion, they're fighting alone. And yet they continue to fight. That is what's so amazing to me about the Palestinian struggle. And then the last thing I want to add is that to me, it's ironic that they are talking about wiping Israel off the map. You know, the allegation was that Iran wanted to wipe Israel off the map. But what we are witnessing is all of these years, Israel has been wiping Palestine off the map.
Eva, I'd like to come back to you because Cynthia said there, you know, it's really hard for people to relate. Now, one area that I sort of think maybe gives people to some degree, I mean, very small degree, an opportunity to relate was what people experienced during lockdown, during the COVID exercise. And obviously that doesn't really give a feeling of what the average Gazan is experiencing. But but what is day-to-day life like?
Yeah, thank you. So bearing in mind that I was last there in March 2013, so I mean, things can only have gotten worse since then. But when I lived there, the power was out, at good times, maybe it was out for 10 hours or 12 hours a day. At worse times, 16, 18, 20 hours a day. So of course, that's going to impact you personally, your ability to do things at home, whether it's work or your refrigerator running. On a more dramatic scale, it impacts the ability of hospitals to function. If you just think about the most important functions in hospital, kidney dialysis machines or whatever's necessary for operations, and hospitals having to rely on generators, which can't run all the time and which there isn't sufficient fuel to run all the time, then hospitals are operating at, it's hard to even say what capacity, but sub-minimum. Added to which the Israeli siege was preventing. Actually, there was an interesting article, it might have been by Amira Haas for Haaretz, an Israeli journalist who writes actually quite honestly about what Israel does to Palestinians. And I believe it was her, and she wrote about how draconian and severe Israel's siege on Gaza was at one point, where it was only allowing the entrance of 30 to 40 items. Which, if you imagine, is just absolutely not sufficient. And I know the detractors will say, well, why should Israel have to allow anything into Gaza? Palestinians should just get it from Egypt. But as Vanessa quite aptly pointed out, there is no way in or out of Gaza that is not controlled by Israel, including the Rafah crossing. So Israel does have an obligation as an occupier to allow the entrance of the vitals of life into Gaza, but it does not do so. So this, this affects people's lives in every aspect. I mean, I remember when I first went there in 2008, I had friends in Esbet Rabo, which is north and east in Gaza, so just kind of east of Jabalia, if people know where that is, but very close to, it's an area that whenever Israel wages a land invasion, is invaded and occupied by the Israeli army, as happened in 2009. But before that, sometime in November or December, before the Israeli assault on Gaza that year began, I was at these friends' house and they were cooking over kerosene because they could not, Israel had cut the entry of cooking gas into Gaza. So if anyone knows how nauseous, how disgusting the smell of kerosene is, imagine cooking your food over that because you have no other option. Or imagine, because there's no electricity, the water cannot be pumped into the holding tanks. So you're just simply cut off from water for days or longer at a time. And this, by the way, is similar in the West Bank because Israel controls the flow of water to areas throughout the West Bank. So I remember in 2007, I was in Hebron, and Israel had determined that the Palestinians had their quota of water for that 3-month period, and they just turned off the taps. Meanwhile, in Israeli colonies, you'll see swimming pools and lush green lawns being watered by sprinklers, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually recently, I think we've seen on Telegram or on Twitter, Israelis mocking the fact that Israel some days ago completely cut off the entry of food, water, electricity, and then internet. And some Israelis were mocking this by, showing the abundance of water they had. But anyway, that's now you're asking about everyday life in Gaza. So if you want to, I was living in central Gaza for a good year or so. So to get to Gaza City, especially after the Israeli war in 2008-9, bridges had been destroyed. So, for example, going along the coastal road from the center of Gaza to Gaza City, we had to go through an area called Wadi Gaza. And because there was no bridge, we had to, the taxis, the shared taxis you would take, would drive through, and this is an area where the sewage that I mentioned earlier is pumped into the sea. So you're basically driving through what smells like a very strong smell of sewage in order to reach Gaza City. Most people can't afford to have generators. So when the power is out, the power is out. Those who can afford generators, and I would say it's a very small percentage, still depend on being able to buy fuel for the generators. So I mean, every aspect of life is disrupted. In 2009, Israel attacked universities, including the, I'm blanking on the name, but it was just attacked recently. I think it was the Islamic University destroying it. And I remember on December 27th, the first day of strikes, there was like 100 bombs that Israel dropped simultaneously by airplanes, F-16s, I guess it was, and helicopters. Everywhere you looked, there was smoke. And I remember the first couple of days, the first few days, I remember people would say, okay, don't go down that street because that could be a target. Although eventually we realized everywhere was a target, and you stopped avoiding anywhere because anywhere's a target. So when you've lived through that, and then the war has officially stopped, but Israel's still firing from the sea and still firing from soldiers or those remote towers along the fence onto farmland, onto farmers, onto civilians. I think what you were pointing out, Cynthia, is very important point. There is and I know Vanessa can echo this, there is a remarkable pulse of life and a lot of beauty in Gaza, which you would not expect because it is so destroyed. But you find this like ability to find beauty in small places or small things, having a fire and roasting eggplant on the fire and making tea on the fire because you have no electricity. I did that many times with Palestinian friends. So I guess it's a funny, not funny. It's a contradiction because every means of living a dignified life. Nobody wants to live on handouts. Palestinians don't want to live on food aid. Most of the people that are dependent on food aid were previously farmers. I mean, Gaza is 2/3 refugees from greater Palestine. But many of the people dependent on food aid are fishers and farmers who could be earning a living or growing or catching their food. And now the food aid is just it's not adequate at all. And it's one of the reasons there's been a huge rise in stunting in children, anemia in pregnant women, diabetes, and many other diseases that are preventable. And that's just related to food. Of course, there's many diseases due to the tainted water that is 95 or 97% undrinkable, again, due to these policies. Vanessa was talking about the pollution, the cutting off of water from the rest of Palestine to Gaza. And actually, just on one final note, Vanessa was mentioning, when Israel's not officially warring on Gaza, there are random bombings, and I can confirm that. In the course of the years that I spent there, on many occasions, there would be nothing happening, and suddenly there was a bombing somewhere nearby. And I remember one occasion watching a number of F-16s fly over the house I was in at night, and watching them go back and forth, and then there was a bombing like a couple hundred meters away, and the ash was raining down in the evening. And it's just like, this is the norm for Palestinians. And Israel can always say, just like they do when they murder Palestinians in the West Bank, then they often plant knives and say, well, they were trying to attack us, whether or not there was actually someone trying to resist the Israeli occupation, which they have the right to do. Usually it's not the case. Usually it was just a Palestinian that was gunned down by an Israeli soldier. And later they just frame the story to be, well, they were a terrorist, so we had to kill them. That's the same thing they do in Gaza.
Vanessa, I'd like to move the conversation on a little bit to the more recent events, in a sense, and that is because I'd like to look at the role of Hamas, and not only the role of Hamas in the recent events, but also the role of Hamas within Gaza itself. What is their role, or what has their role been?
It is quite a complex question. I think the first thing I would say is that it's very interesting to me that suddenly this resistance operation, which is probably the largest and the most well-planned and the most effective in the history of the Palestinian resistance, is being suddenly framed as Israel against Hamas, which denies agency to the multiple other resistance factions that are involved in the operation, including, I think it's around 17 different factions inside Gaza itself, but also the newly formed resistance factions, for example, in Jenin and in Nablus and in various areas of the West Bank, for example. And the framing of this particular conflict as Israel versus Hamas, in my opinion, added to the fact that people are layering that over with information that Israel in the past has created Hamas, that it has backed Hamas, that it has provided support for Hamas, just as it has done, of course, for Fatah in the West Bank also, and that Hamas had a history as a Muslim Brotherhood organization of being involved in the destabilization of Syria, working alongside groups like Al-Qaeda that were effectively backed by Qatar, as was Hamas for some time inside Gaza. But what people are ignoring are the multiple meetings and communications that have been going on for probably the last 2 years between the resistance axis, which includes Iran, Hezbollah, the Hashd al-Shabi factions, the PMU in Iraq, the Syria and Lebanon, of course, with Hamas and with all of the Palestinian resistance factions, to bring about the unity that has made this operation possible. And that has included normalization in Syria. Many Syrians were not approving of President Assad's meeting with Hamas because they feel that Hamas had a large role in the destabilization of Syria. But when I spoke to people at the Palestinian Solidarity Rally on Friday, the 13th of October, so here in Damascus, that's forgotten because the Palestinian cause is one of the reasons that the war was waged against Syria in the first place. So Syrians now are uniting behind what they see as a Palestinian resistance push to release themselves from Zionist occupation. And so therefore the Hamas today is not necessarily the Hamas of 2 years ago, 10 years ago, or even from 2006 when they were elected to the government inside Gaza. Now, you asked about how it is in Gaza under Hamas. I mean, the one thing that I would say, there were, during the time that I was in Gaza, there were protests against Hamas. I mean, you would expect opposition to any government in any country, right? Over the fact that, for example, Western literature, or not even Western, Russian, any kind of literature was being prevented entry into Gaza to the universities and to the schools, for example. But one thing I will say, and I think Eva will agree with me, is that under Hamas, Gaza was, even despite the conditions that Gazans live under, it was one of the safest places I've ever been. You know, I could go out at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and it actually happened even during the war that we got stuck in Khan Yunis and there were no taxis because Israel was bombing, and we had to get back from Khan Yunis to oh God, the name's escaping me, Eva, the area where we were staying next to the Quds Hotel. Near Shati Beach Camp, basically, on the coast. And so the risk of bombing, of being targeted, because we were walking alone on the road to try and get back or try and get a lift, and we were picked up immediately, right? Now, in any country in the world, I would be very cautious about that. But in Gaza, there was never any threat from anyone, any sort of criminality, or any resentment that we were foreigners inside Gaza. We were completely safe, even in the most unsafe moments inside Gaza. So if you're asking what was life like under the Hamas government, I would say it was very secure. And of course, the Hamas government, so the political wing, is also, I would say, and I don't know if Eva agrees with me, separate really to the armed resistance. I met with armed resistance factions. They were just young men who had lost members of their family, seen their families threatened, seen their little brothers killed in front of them, had their mothers, their sisters threatened with rape. That's another thing that people probably don't even know about, is that regularly women inside Gaza would be sent disgusting pornographic videos. Their photos would be downloaded from Facebook, and they would be manipulated by AI, for example, and they would be sent these hideous pornographic videos threatening them with rape and so on, particularly during the various offensive, but even during peacetime. the women were targeted by the Zionist forces for intimidation, for sexual exploitation and sexual intimidation. And you're speaking about a very conservative society. For women to receive this kind of stuff is very invasive and intrusive and disturbing for them. So it's part of the campaign of trauma, right? So I was talking about the kind of division between the political and the armed resistance. The armed resistance, as I said, was born out of the young people inside Gaza in a reaction to the daily abuse that was being meted out against them by the Zionists.
Eva, have you any thoughts on this?
On Hamas and the resistance?
Yeah, on Hamas and their role inside Gaza. I mean, do you have anything to add to what Vanessa has said?
Oh, no, I think Vanessa very articulately explained. I guess I'd just add a couple of things. I remember before Hamas was elected, the West was encouraging Palestinians to have elections. I guess they just didn't expect Hamas to be elected. I remember I think Richard Gere was like out there saying Palestinians should have elections. And I would also differentiate between the fighters and the political aspect of Hamas. I also knew some Hamas members, and I suppose that would get us arrested in European and North American countries. But they were people who were they would describe it as defending their land, and I think that's a very adequate description. I mean, we've all Cynthia, Vanessa, myself, and Mike, you've contributed. We've laid out what Palestinians have been enduring. And this is only with respect to Gaza. You know, we haven't even gotten into the Nakba and the 75 years of what they've endured under Zionist terrorism. But even just looking at Gaza, a microcosm of that, it couldn't be clearer than day that they're fighting for their very existence. The Hamas that I knew were very respectful to me. They and their families treated me like a guest, like a daughter. I slept in their home. I was never afraid. I was never felt like, oh my God, I'm afraid they're going to hurt me. No, to the contrary. Like Vanessa was saying, I felt very safe.
Well, I think I think the point that both of you are making about the importance of Hamas within the Gaza setting is important, because I've got friends and people I have associated with. I can't be an expert on everything. And so I have to rely on other people who have experience, history, expertise, and that sort of thing. And I rely on that. But the surprising thing that I'm hearing is an effort to discredit Hamas based on its past, or maybe its past collaborationist history. And people like me who are not so familiar with all of the historical aspects of the struggle and haven't been studying the struggle from that perspective for a very long time, might be surprised and say, oh my goodness, Hamas is actually one of them. And so therefore I have to go along with the official US or Western narrative. And what I think Eva and Vanessa are saying is that absolutely not. And that what we have to do is look at the Palestinian struggle itself and who has remained true to the Palestinian struggle itself, and who the Palestinians actually selected to be their leaders when there were free and fair elections that were internationally scrutinized and deemed to be so. So there's something to be said for that as well. And so I think we need to directly hit or respond to our friends who are saying, well, you have to disregard Hamas because of its past.
And I think, yeah, exactly that, Cynthia. And I think that was my point in the solidarity rallies in Damascus, where, they have every right to criticize Hamas. They are standing behind not only Hamas, they're standing behind what they describe as the Palestinian resistance. The problem is, as I said, if you go back to 2021, for example, all the media was talking about Palestinian resistance factions. They were not focusing in on Hamas. And I think this is a deliberate manipulation by Western and Zionist-controlled media to deflect people's attention from what this is about to Hamas. And people are falling for it. They're getting involved in the minutiae about the history of Hamas, and they're forgetting that this is an existential struggle, not only by Palestine, actually, but by the entire Arab world against the Zionist entity that has held them hostage for decades, since the British allowed them to flourish in the region. And then, obviously, the US got involved, and Israel became the military outpost in the Middle East for the US and for the UK. And we've seen their role, for example, in Syria, in the destabilization of Syria, where they've been backing Al-Qaeda and ISIS, where they've been regularly bombing Syria. In the last few days, they've bombed Damascus, Aleppo airport twice. It was just reopened and they bombed it again, right? And here in Syria, we live constantly under the threat of Zionist aggression, either directly or by proxy. 2 days before the Operation Al-Aqsa flood, we had a massacre in Homs. Drones were sent by the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Idlib that massacred more than 80 people, mostly civilians, children, and injured up to 300. Right? That was 2 days before the operation. And Israel has a hand in this. Its hand is in every destabilization project in the region. So this is not a struggle between Hamas and Israel. This is an existential struggle against an entity that is embedded in the region and that is causing and is responsible for much of the destabilization, the partitioning, the sending countries back to the dark ages, stunting development. The list is endless. So, the danger is that even independent media outlets are getting distracted by this kind of Hamas canard that's being put out there. And I wish they wouldn't, because if the resistance is united and is fighting this battle, then we should be supporting it. We shouldn't actually be responsible for undermining the agency of the resistance, which is permissible under international law. It's upheld under international law.
And the other thing that I would add is that we, from wherever we might be situated in the world, cannot, how can I say, turn to the patriarchal view or whatever. I mean, it's like that we know better than those who are fighting the fight. And so those who are fighting the fight, I'm sure they're far more aware of who the players are than we are. And if we are acting in solidarity, in many respects, Western people have to learn how to act in solidarity without taking over somebody else's struggle. And so if this is the resistance and I am in support of the resistance, then I'm in support of their leadership and their ability to discern what's right for them.
Absolutely. And if I can just add on to that, I 100% echo what you've both said. And often critics, and not simply the predictable corporate-owned Western media and Western governments, but people who are nominally in solidarity with Palestinians, but then tell them, like you were saying, Cynthia, they have no place to tell them how they choose to resist. But one criticism will be, well, why are you resisting violently? Well, number one, it is permissible under international law. Number two, when they nonviolent resist, they're gunned down. I have in my time in Gaza, aside from accompanying farmers, I also accompanied nonviolent protest. And the Israelis do not start with rubber-coated metal bullets or tear gas canisters. They start with live ammunition, firing at the head and bodies of these Palestinian youths, which I saw on many, many occasions. But if you remember the Gaza Great March of Return, which was and over 200 unarmed Palestinians were killed, including a young nurse who was shot in the head, I believe, when her back was turned to the Israeli snipers. So, the audacity of people who, number one, have never lived a fraction of the terror and the hell Palestinians endure on a daily basis, the audacity of them to tell Palestinians you can only resist nonviolently. No, that's not true. And also, when they do resist nonviolently, they're gunned down, and Israel still controls the narrative and says these were terrorists.
And here's the other thing that I think, just from my point of view, Israel controls the narrative because Western governments allow Israel to control the narrative. So now, why is it that Western governments allow Israel to control the narrative? And no matter whom we elect, particularly in the US, I can speak about the US Congress and our, not only the legislative branch, but the executive branch as well, that these people are they have signed a pledge, they have signed an oath of allegiance to a foreign state. And so now you've got someone in Biden's, not in the cabinet, but I think in the State Department, who's being prosecuted as an unregistered foreign agent because of his relationship with Iran. But we've got people who have more than whatever this guy has of a relationship, who have signed an oath saying that I'm going to ensure the military superiority of Israel, that I'm going to ensure that Jerusalem is the capital city, just obliterating whatever international agreements might come or might already be on the books, obliterating all of that and giving Israel the wherewithal to do all of these things, to conduct this kind of business, criminal business, with impunity. And that comes from our governments. And so now we, rather than trying to instruct the Palestinians how to resist, we need to be trying to figure out how to resist our own governments so that they can be more fair and more just in their international interactions, period.
I want to deal with a couple of other issues. First of all, Eva, if I come to you first, obviously we've been talking mainly about Gaza in this so far, but what is going on in the West Bank at the moment, and what's their attitude to what's been happening over the past week?
I might actually defer to Vanessa because I believe you've been following that a bit closer. I can say that there have been Palestinians in various cities and towns in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank, staging protests, attacking Israeli military checkpoints. But also there's been a rise in the illegal Jewish Israeli colonists attacking Palestinian civilians, which is a norm, which is never prosecuted. And, in terms of the crimes Palestinians have endured, these illegal colonists have been extremely violent, and they've committed heinous acts, including pouring gasoline down a Palestinian youth down his throat and burning him alive some years ago. But as I believe you were saying earlier, Vanessa, when you were talking about resistance across Palestine, and Marwa Osman made that point yesterday on RT, that there is a unition in the resistance amongst Palestinians across Palestine that we haven't seen in a very long time. But Vanessa, maybe you want to, I don't know if you've been following a bit more closely in what's happening in the West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, of course, it's very related, actually, I think, this is my opinion, to the normalization of relations between particularly Syria and President Assad and Hamas. And once that those meetings were had, what we started to see was the emergence of new resistance factions, as I mentioned in Jenin and Nablus, the Lion's Den resistance faction. And we actually started to see the beginnings of this unification of the resistance axis that we've been talking about. So you started to actually see Syrian flags being held up in Jenin and Nablus alongside the Palestinian flag. So for me, that was a direct message from the resistance that they were recognizing themselves as part of a larger resistance axis. There was a very good interview that I mentioned to you, Mike, before we came on, with Alistair Crook, whose analysis I think is absolutely spot on. And he made the point that in recent weeks, even the 79 Palestinians who historically have been considered themselves almost Israeli citizens, even they have risen up alongside the new resistance factions in the West Bank. And another point that he made, which I actually thought was really interesting, is the lack of representation for the original Jews in Palestine, so the Mizrahi Jews that come from North Africa and from the Middle East, who are themselves marginalized by the Ashkenazi Jews, by the European settlers. And he pointed out that, for example, I think it's in the Supreme Court, I have to double check that, but the representation, for example, is 15 Ashkenazi Jews and 1 Mizrahi. So he's saying that basically even they have been largely marginalized by the influx of European settlers post-Second World War. And what actually led to this operation, of course, there's the religious context of the fact that the Zionists want to create Temple Mount. In order to create Temple Mount, they have to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque. So hence why this is called Al-Aqsa Flood, because 2 days before the operation, there was the massacre in Homs. And the day after that, of course, was the 50th anniversary of the October War in 1973, or the Yom Kippur War, as Israelis will call it, which was another time that the Israelis' surveillance was bypassed by Egypt and Syria. There was a storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque by 800 extremist settlers supported by the Zionist security forces. And Al-Aqsa has always been the red line. So the destruction of Al-Aqsa is a red line for Palestinians generally, and for Arabs generally. Okay, so 2 days after that came Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. But I think what we've been seeing is a development of the resistance over the last 2 years. And Marwa also spoke about this, Marwa Osman, yesterday on an interview with RT, that the resistance factions in the occupied territories have been growing in strength and the ability to use force instead of stones against the Zionist occupation. And of course, this is very much what I mentioned, the brilliant article by Louis Alday, the inalienable right of Palestinians to resist. In the West, as Cynthia sort of touched upon, it's almost like we're happy to stand in solidarity when the Palestinians, when they're just photogenic victims. But when the tide is turned and when Palestinians have the ability to resist by force, suddenly the solidarity starts to waver. And as Cynthia said, it's not our place to tell Palestinians how to resist. It's not our battle, effectively. It's not the life that we are living. We don't understand it. Even I would say, even I don't understand fully what Gazans have to live through, because I have the ability to leave. The same in Syria. I have the ability to leave. I have a passport. I have an exit route out of Syria if I need it. So that always gives me a safety net. People in Gaza don't have that safety net. People in Syria don't have that safety net. And it's very hard for Westerners, I think, to understand that, because we as Westerners, we always have the ability to move around, right? Nobody stops us. Nobody prevents us. Nobody shoots us for trying to leave our country or drowns us or puts us into incredibly dangerous sex smuggling, sex trafficking, organ trafficking situations. We never had to face any of that. So it's very difficult to have empathy with why this operation is happening and why Palestinians finally are really rising up in a unified manner against their oppressors for the last 75 years, beyond 75 years. But let's say it started in 1948.
Yeah, and I in a post on my Telegram channel, I said a fairly obvious thing that I think we've all thought, like, it's only Israel that could do this. It's only Israel that could first imprison 2.4 million Palestinians, besiege them brutally for over 15 years, bombard them, destroy critical infrastructure, including hospitals, order them to leave via the Rafah crossing, bomb the Rafah crossing so they can't leave, order half the population to go to the south so they can destroy the north, cut off all food, water, electricity, internet so they can't document Israel's crimes. It's only Israel that could do this. I mean, the narratives that the media is pushing, emanating, of course, from the Western warmongers, it's so ludicrous. Like for over a decade, they supported this and they continue to, this absurd narrative that Al-Qaeda and affiliated terrorist groups in Syria are rebels, that they're saving the Syrian people. They backed them fully. They continue to back them fully. And frankly, they've stolen in their White Helmets productions and their Al-Qaeda and Idlib productions, they've stolen Palestinian narratives, real stories, real atrocities, real suffering. And they've foisted them onto their Al-Qaeda lackeys, and they've said, look how the Syrian quote unquote regime is killing or starving Syrians. And we know, by the way, I'm sorry, this is an aside, but in every case where they accused the Syrian government of starving civilians, it was always the Western-backed Al-Qaeda, Jaish al-Islam, et cetera, terrorist rebels, unquote, quote unquote, that were starving the people. And so it's just, it's staggering. I mean, it's not to us because we all know, we've been reading this, we've been living this, we've been trying to explain this for years and years, but nonetheless, it's staggering just how Israel can be genociding to such a degree right now, in continuation with this its long-term cleansing of Palestinian people, how they can be doing this and at the same time be portrayed as the victims and Palestinians who are resisting as the aggressors.
Cynthia, can I come to you and ask, because we've seen reports, I presume they're taking them at face value, of Hezbollah attacking across the Lebanese border. We've seen reports of the US redeploying troops in the region. The US, of course, has said at least one, possibly two aircraft carriers. The UK has redeployed troops, Marines in the area. What do you think are the dangers of escalation?
Well, oh gosh, I think the possibilities of escalation are real. And there are some forces within the United States that say that now is the time for the United States to intervene militarily against both Russia and China, because this is the window within which China can be contained and that Russia can be defeated. Well, so they think anyway. And so this is a very, very dangerous period. And what we are seeing with the involvement of the West in Ukraine and the way NATO and the West are basically turning Ukraine into a meat grinder against the Russians, but the whole effort is targeting Russia inside Ukraine, is in and of itself an escalation. And this is another escalation. The question I have is, does this play into the already established plans? We've seen maps produced by US think tanks of the balkanization of Russia. We've seen maps produced by various U.S. military personnel about the balkanization of that entire area from Central Asia over to West Asia. We've seen that. We are aware of the Greater Israel Project. And you could say that the creation of ISIS, and maybe even before that, the creation of Al-Qaeda, and then ISIS and Daesh, and all of the various US-generated formations of Muslims fighting Muslims, or as Wesley Clark said, who fights Hezbollah? Zealots. And that's who fights Hezbollah. So the creation of these so-called zealots by US and Western policy, perhaps this is the moment where all of this is unfolding because it was planned decades ago. Those maps are not new. The maps of the balkanization of Russia, not new. The maps of the balkanization of Central Asia and Western Asia are not new. None of this is new. So maybe this is somebody pulled the trigger and it's happening now.
Vanessa, anything to add?
No, I mean, I think just on the subject of escalation, I think what you're seeing is actually extreme reserve from the countries that are part of the resistance axis. And this is, of course, always forgotten. You know, who is always the aggressor? It's the US and the UK and Israel. Hezbollah has made it absolutely clear it will retaliate to any attacks on Lebanese soil. And guess what has happened? The Zionists have attacked Lebanese positions in southern Lebanon. So Hezbollah has responded, and it has every right to do so, of course. I think it was it yesterday or the day before, there were a team of journalists fired on by the Zionists, and a Reuters journalist killed. And actually, I think Marwa was saying yesterday, one of the journalists, a girl that she knows, who's working for another channel, I can't remember which one, inside Lebanon, she may well lose her leg as a result of the attack. This is not spoken about. Reuters have even refused to lay the responsibility on Israel. They've just basically said, well, the journalists were attacked, but not by who? Because again, they're following through on their Pledge of Allegiance, and they're protecting Israel. So what we're seeing is complete reserve. You don't see Syria retaliating for the attacks on airports and on civilian infrastructure, and you haven't seen it for the last 11 years. Iran is not retaliating, but what they are all saying is this is a battle for Palestinian resistance factions. If at any time the US intervenes or the UK intervenes or any other nation intervenes in this war, then they will enter the war. So the onus is on the West in reality. You know, as Cynthia said, why aren't our governments trying to broker peace? Why weren't they trying to broker peace in Ukraine? Why weren't they trying to broker peace in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq? The list is endless, in Yemen. And the reality is they don't want peace. We know this. We absolutely know this. But as I said, the resistance axis countries, I'm sorry, I should always include Yemen. And Yemen has even put out a statement that if the US gets involved, then Yemen will get involved. And, you know, we know that even Yemen has the capability to strike Tel Aviv now. 2 aircraft carriers. The resistance in Palestine has the capability to strike 2 aircraft carriers. We're not looking at the same battlefield that we've looked at in previous years. It's a very different playing field right now. And as Cynthia said, yes, maybe this has been the plan, but the resistance has been preparing for that plan.
We're more or less out of time, but I want you to take as much time as you need to sort of answer or to answer this question, because just to end, I'd like to get all your thoughts on, you know, how this gets resolved. Does it get resolved with removal of Israel as a nation state? What is the answer to this, actually? Let's start with Eva.
I'm always reluctant, first of all, to make predictions, but also to speak on behalf of Palestinians other than, my observations from there. But it is their right to have their historic land back. It is their right for refugees to return to the land they were expelled from, and descendants of those refugees to be able to go to their homeland. And it's their right to live without occupation. How they resolve that is their choice. I mean, I believe many would see a one state where everybody has equal rights as being an option. But again, that's not something I can say. What is not acceptable is what has been pushed, and what some even nominally supportive of Palestine continue to push, and that is the so-called two-state solution, which is absolutely in contrast to every right they have. So, but again, also this is not only about Palestinians, as both Vanessa and Cynthia have made clear. It's all the countries that are being affected by Zionist aggression. So how it will be resolved. I mean, unfortunately, it has come down to having to resist by every means possible. But when it's been decades of Zionist aggression, well. And as Vanessa just made abundantly clear, there will never be any honest Western efforts to find any sort of peaceful, just solution. So this is what we're left with.
Cynthia, have you got any thoughts?
Well, the only thing is, I agree with Eva that really this is what we're left with. And I teach my kids about Frantz Fanon and Paulo Freire and the ways in which colonialism has resulted from direct violence, and the neo-colonized world in which we live today continues not only direct violence, but structural violence and cultural violence, all of the violences that can be visited upon people are done so within the colonial setting and within this neo-colonial setting. So Frantz Fanon was criticized when he said, well, then we have to fight violence with violence. And I think that even if I use my own example of the US civil rights movement and the sort of schism that occurred between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was the nonviolent social change leader, and you had Malcolm X, who was the one who said, well, we have to speak in the language that they understand. Well, bottom line is that as an African-American, I got the right to vote because both of them were there, not because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Prevailed. No, actually, he didn't prevail. And it was only because you had Malcolm on one side, Martin on the other side, that I was able to then get a civil rights act that would allow me to go into a restaurant and eat. And this is during my lifetime, that would allow me to be able to not only cast a vote, but then to actually serve in the US Congress. These are laws that are within my lifetime. So I would say that both strains are required in order. One needs to be able to speak the language that they understand, and at the same time hold close to the values that motivate the resistance in the first place.
Vanessa?
I was just looking for a quote from President Gamal Abdel Nasser that he made in, I think it was in the late 50s. And he said, colonization and Zionism combined to dispossess the inhabitants and establish a state founded on religion. How is it possible to accept the status quo when the Arabs were expelled, their property plundered, and their women and children murdered? Peace must be based on justice. The problem will not come to an end until justice is done. And I think, for me, justice for the Palestinians means bringing Israel to a point where they have to face the justice and no longer be protected by our governments from that justice. And as to how the resistance fights their war to bring an end to their suffering and to their occupation, their exploitation, their extermination. I mean, that is what is going on right now. Israel and the US, Biden has made it quite clear that Israel should finish this. In other words, that the extermination of the Palestinians should be final now. That's been clear in the rhetoric from the majority of American bipartisan politicians, and in the UK, full support for Israel from Ursula von der Leyen, who, while supporting terrorist crimes against the people of Donbass, against the people of Syria, against the people of Palestine, does not condemn Israel for cutting off water, for cutting off food, for destroying essential infrastructure, etc. You know, the hypocrisy is rank from Western regimes right now. And as Cynthia has pointed out, their pledge to support Israel is what has led to the need for the resistance to rise up to this extent. And for us to condemn the resistance for being forced to rise up to this extent is insanity. So I think we all should let the resistance get on with it. We should support them in their fight for justice, because without justice, we know that there can be no resolution, there can be no freedom, there can be no peace. Without recognition of the crime against the Palestinian people, there can be no peace in the region.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all three. And I just would like to end by saying the deaths have to end in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Ukraine. We have to do everything that we can to avoid this any escalation into a broader conflict. And we've got to find the justice that you are expressing, Vanessa. And so thank you very much to all.